Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Joy of Science, a Research Matters podcast. In today's episode, I, Spoorthy Raman, will be talking to Professor Anuradha Bhat from the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, IISER Kolkata. Professor Bhat is the principal investigator of the Fish Ecology and Behaviour Lab at IISER, and she has extensively studied the behaviour of fish over the last decade. Professor Bhat, welcome to this episode, and we are delighted to have you.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you. So, if you like seafood, then you're pretty well aware of the diversity of fish found in India. There are different dishes that are prepared based on what kind of fish is available. There are some fish that come from fresh water, like rivers and streams, and there are some which come from the oceans, basically saltwater fish. Oh, but did you know that there are some fish which live in estuaries, that are regions where the river meets the oceans, and they have special species out there which are called estuarian fish? Oh yes, and Professor Bhat has worked with a lot of fish communities, and today we are going to learn more about her work and interact with her regarding why that work is interesting. So Professor Bhat, thank you. We'll start off with the first question. So, could you please explain to us why you decided to work with fish, and why is fish an interesting organism for you?
Hello, Spoorthy. Yes, fishes are actually one of the most fascinating, at least to me, one of the most fascinating creatures because they are spread across the entire globe. You can find them in the northernmost parts of the world to the middle of the equator down to the southernmost pole. You find them everywhere. You find them in fresh waters, you find them in the sea, you find them in the estuaries. They're everywhere, ubiquitous really, which is what is fascinating about them. Makes you wonder how it is that they have spread themselves so much. So that's probably one of the first reasons why I would say I got interested in studying them. But of course I've been studying them for now for the last more than 2 decades.
Okay.
Yeah, and there are, I mean, over the years, I have started with looking at one aspect of fishes and now moved on to looking at more than that aspect, including the previous one, to further new aspects. And more and more questions keep coming up.
That's true. That's true. So yeah, looks like you are really driven by the diversity of the fish. So one of the things when we look at fish around us is, as you said, they are present everywhere. But oftentimes they are in the news when they are dead in huge numbers on in ponds or rivers or something, and most often it is because of some kind of pollutant that is there which is causing the harm. So ecologically, do you think they have a role? Point one. And the second thing is, why are we seeing why are fishes the first victims of such disasters?
Yes, unfortunately they are extremely sensitive. They do occupy a very critical part of the food web, in the sense that they are both at the lower primary consumer level, they are in the top consumer level as well. So depending on which species you're studying, you will see different aspects of the food web being looked at.
Okay, so that means to say they also eat the planktons that is on the river, and they can also be carnivorous.
Exactly.
Okay.
So which is why some of them might be very sensitive to even the slightest changes in the ecosystem. Some of them might be much more robust. And this is one of the reasons why they can be called as indicators of ecological change, especially in aquatic systems. So anything that perturbs the system, most likely at some point the fishes would get affected.
Okay.
So you might have seen many, newspaper reports of some mass deaths of fishes because of poisoning, for instance.
That's true.
This is an indicator. I mean, that is the prime example of why fishes, are very important, because they are so sensitive to the smallest things that are happening.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Bhat, for that insight. And then, considering the country that we live in India, there are a lot of freshwater bodies. We have a great length of coastline. There are fish that is living in the oceans and in the water bodies that we have within, which are landlocked, like ponds and rivers and things like that. So, considering, I'm assuming that there is a wide variety of diversity. Considering that, do you have any numbers that you can, probably share with us on top of your mind in terms of what is the fish diversity in the country, how many species are found, and among those that are found, how many are actually studied like the way you do?
So, interestingly, we are considered one of the most diverse ecosystems as far as freshwater systems are concerned. And unfortunately, though, we don't even know how much of this diversity there is. Though rough estimates are there. If you look at good textbooks on fish, there are ballpark numbers like 2,000. But then really we don't know. Okay, these are speculations. So there are taxonomic books that have counted up to 1,100 books, fishes, for instance, which are at least tabulated, but we know that there are many more. So it's one of the most diverse ecosystems, the Indian subcontinent, as far as I know, but we don't know the full actual numbers.
That is a sad situation.
Yeah, and which is again why I find it interesting, that I find it important for us to at least get started to fill up this gap.
True. So do you think that it could be possibilities that there are new species that we do not know of, and there are new kind of environments where fish are found that we don't even have any idea of?
Absolutely. Every year new species are being described within India.
Okay.
So there are new species which have not been described from many parts in the Western Ghats, for instance. Western Ghats being one of the most biodiversity rich regions of the world. There are many species of freshwater fishes found in regions like in Kerala. Many new species are being described there. Even in the Northeast, for instance. Northeast is one of the lesser studied regions. Again, we don't know how many there are, and because we don't have enough people studying those regions. So I'm sure if people do extensive studies in the northeastern regions, there'll be new species coming up.
Wow, that means to say for aspiring ecologists, there is a whole new study of fishes awaiting them to be explored and looked into at greater depth.
Absolutely.
That's great. And then the other interesting aspect of your study has been studying fish communities. So when you talk about communities, give us a sense of what is the fish community when you for your study purposes. And the second thing is, why are fish communities at a larger level more important to be studied?
Right. So from an ecologist's perspective, community is essentially a group of species of different kinds occupying a certain defined ecosystem region. Okay.
So can I say that it could be like a school of fish that is found in a neighboring pond? Is that a community?
Yeah, it comprises of many different species living in the same habitat.
Okay.
The common thing about them is that they all occupy the same kind of ecological conditions around them. So that's what you call as a community. And I particularly am interested in looking at communities of fishes found in moving waters, the streams and the rivers. Although of course there are stream communities in say ponds and lakes, and you could study those as well, but I have been studying the flowing waters. I'm more fascinated by them because these habitats are extremely dynamic. They change starting from the upstreams to the downstream. You see a lot of ecological changes happening. There are highly turbulent aquatic habitats in the upper reaches of a river, for instance. So those would harbor very, very specific kinds of fish communities. As you move further downstream, the water conditions change, the habitat environment changes, and that also harbors yet another multitude of species. And each step along this, you see a gradient of changes. And the interaction of these species and how the ecological conditions drive these species compositions is what I find extremely interesting.
Wow, this is very definitely interesting, I'm sure. Can you give us a sense of how do you study? So when you say you are studying fish, do you really go to the field, collect them? How is the study done?
Right. A lot of this part of my research involves a lot field work, and we actually go to these sites. We do sample collections of fishes from different environments, different habitats, and we, along with collecting the fishes, we also look at the ecological properties of those habitats. So we actually collect data on the kind of stream structure, the physical structure of the stream, the chemical quality of the water, which again is very important for the kind of fishes that survive. So we collect data of this entire combination of things along with the fish data, And this is done along the stream from the upstream regions all the way to the downstream regions.
Wow.
And we have specific locations which are routinely sampled,
Okay.
so that we can get an idea of the spatial data,
Right.
along with the temporal changes,
Mhm,
because
mhm.
seasonality also matters.
That's true. Yeah.
So we are looking at temporal as well as seasonal changes,
Mhm.
and try to combine the role of ecological conditions on the community of species that are found there.
Mhm. Are there any specific areas in India that you're looking at
Yes.
these studies?
Yeah, so I started out as a PhD student in the Indian Institute of Science, and I did my PhD in the Western Ghats.
Okay.
So my first attraction towards fishes started from there, because it's, as we all know, it's such a rich region,
Right.
and nobody had looked at fish studies in Central Western Ghats. There was no literature available at that point. And so my supervisor strongly encouraged me to start working, though I had absolutely no background before that. So my work on the Western Ghats started, and I did my PhD there. But once I was done with that, I did not want to stop. And I realized that Western Ghats is just one small splash in the
Right.
pond. The entire country is out there. And looking at the literature that was available at that time, I realized that there are huge gaps everywhere. And when I moved out after my PhD, I went abroad for my postdoc and came back. I realized that I need to fill up that gap. And so as I joined in IISER Kolkata, I realized that I could start looking elsewhere.
Okay.
We go beyond Western Ghats.
Right.
So I started looking at Central India.
Okay.
My first study site was in the Narmada River Basin.
Oh, wow.
Again, that's one of those regions where we do know some amount of data is available on the rivers in the Narmada Basin itself, but we don't know anything around that. So, for instance, there are Vindhya and the Satpura ranges on the north and the south part of the Narmada Basin, and there are lots of hill streams that flow from these hill ranges and move into the Narmada. So whatever you see in the Narmada is dependent on the streams that are flowing on both sides, and we don't know anything about that. So my next big study area is this region of Central India. And after that, I've also been kind of expanding my studies. My current students are now also studying the northern part of Bengal, which is the sub-Himalayan region.
Okay.
Which again is a unique area where not much is studied, nothing much is known. So now I have about 3 very large regions which I'm trying to study.
Great.
Hopefully in the future we'll try to put them all together.
That's nice. And I'm sure all the 3 areas are very unique in their own way. And I'm just surprised that when you go to these places, obviously most places that you would be studying are places that are probably rural or quite remote in their existence. Have you ever been asked, or could you share some anecdotes about how people around you react to it?
Yes.
And could be like people would be surprised that you're looking at fish and then doing your PhD and things like that?
Yes, it's actually true. Large part of my work has been in rural and often very forested areas, and local people are often fascinated by what we do.
Oh, wow.
But I must say that it's interesting that none of them have been discouraging about the work that we
That's
do.
interesting.
So they are in fact fascinated. They might come out of curiosity initially. They might want to come and see what you're doing. So very often they will wonder whether you're catching fish to eat. So the first thing they will ask is, why are you catching fish? Do you want to eat them? And then we have to explain that this is not for eating, and then they get even more surprised because they wonder why you are here. Because
catching fish and not
eating them. So then I explain that we are looking at this question, we are doing research, and have to explain what research is. So, but the good thing is that they are always interested and they're positive about it. In fact, I've had many situations when local, especially younger children, they follow us. They come and they even help us do some of our sampling. They love to be involved. They love to see what we are doing and how we are doing it in every place. I started out in the Western Ghats. I saw this happening in Central India. The same thing I have seen also in North Bengal. It's always
interesting.
been, it's really wonderful.
And I think your work is already inspiring a lot of people around. And do they have any sense of pride in terms of saying, okay, we have fish population that people are coming from miles far away to come and study here.
Yes. They find a little surprising, and they in fact give us information.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
like for instance, each region has its own unique diversity of fishes, and they have their own local names.
Okay.
So, which is a great thing for me, because I also am interested in looking at how people utilize the local diversity. A lot of these fishes are not commercial species, which are not sold in large markets, because they are all very small hill stream fishes. Yet they are used by the local people in small scale. They are sold in the local market, and they have their names. And these people are very happy to share these information with me. Like for instance, some of these fishes might have some medicinal properties. Some of them might be used for some other purposes. They do tell us about it,
This
and
is very
we get to learn a lot from them as well.
Absolutely. So I think there is this good marriage of ecological studies with traditional knowledge of what is the importance of these organisms to humanity from years ago.
Yes.
Switching gears here, Professor, the other aspect of your work has been behavioral studies on fish, and one of the chosen fish has been zebrafish. Could you please tell us why zebrafish and what's interesting about this particular species of fish?
Right. Zebrafish, if you ask anybody, the first thing that comes to mind, people who have heard about it would say that it's the classical model system for studying genetics and medical research, because that's where all the literature on zebrafish has been found so far. Unfortunately, people do not also understand that these are also native fishes.
Right.
And many people in India don't even know that zebrafish is actually native to India.
Oh wow, okay. Are there any local names?
Lot of local names. In fact, each region has its own name for it. For instance, in the region in Bengal where it is found very commonly, people call it dhani. So dhani is dhan means rice. And they are found in paddy fields.
Wow, okay.
So, which is why the word dhani. And if you look at the scientific name, you'll also see it's called Danio redio, which is Danio. The word comes from
dhani.
Yes. Yeah. So there are of course local other names also which other people use, but this is where it came from. And my interest in this happened because when I started looking at behavior, there are many systems that you could study. One can ask why zebrafish. You can study some other species too.
Right.
So indeed you can. When I started my first forays into looking at fish behavior, my first model system I studied was actually the guppies.
Okay.
I got interested in it simply because at that time the laboratory as a postdoc where I worked was studying guppies as a model system. And I got interested in not in the system, but rather on the questions that were being asked. Okay, I was interested in looking at what kind of behaviors fishes like these display, what drives these behaviors ecologically. As an ecologist, my first question is what is the ecological link for certain behavior. I learned my initial ideas about behavior through working on these guppies.
Okay.
But then as I moved on, I realized that I want to do more in behavior. And also as a postdoc, I was thinking of returning back to India. I realized that we need to look at a native fish. And what better species than zebrafish, given that there's a lot of already existing literature on zebrafish, not from the perspective of behavior or ecology, but rather on the perspective of medical research. The entire genome of zebrafish has been mapped. So it gives a very nice base, right? But on the other hand, we have a huge gap with regards to our knowledge about what wild zebrafish do in nature, which nobody has done. So that kind of attracted me. So when I came back to India and I joined IISER Kolkata, to my fascination, I found this. I was sitting in the hotspot of zebrafish habitat. All around me are habitats conducive for zebrafish. So I started out looking at zebrafish.
Definitely, you hit a jackpot when you landed here in Kolkata to find out there is so much of relevance in what you do and how your work impacts what your surroundings and stuff like that. So when you talk about behavior studies, and let's take for example on zebrafish, how does these behavioral studies start up with? So do you just go to fields, catch some wild zebrafish, put them in a local aquarium sort of a set up in your lab and keep looking at the fish for a few days, or how does it go?
Yeah, we do a little bit of both, in the sense that ideally, if you want to study behavior, you should study them in the wild.
Right.
Because you're asking questions about how an organism behaves, and the first thing you should do is how it is doing, what it's doing outside.
Right.
So we do actually go to the natural habitats and try to understand as much as possible how they shoal, for instance, and what kind of habitats they survive in. That's the first level that you can look at from the behavior perspective. But unfortunately, it's not always possible to do everything in the field. Like the kind of habitats where they are found are typically very murky. The habitats that you see them shoaling, you cannot see below a few centimeters. So if you really want to study intricate behavioral, responses of fish, you won't be able to notice them. So then you need to do something which would be a compromise, which is what we end up having to do. We actually collect some basic data in the field about how large is a group, how their exploratory behavior is at some level of understanding. But then beyond that, we have to collect them. So we do collect them and bring them to the labs. And we have these set laboratory tanks where they are housed. And after we bring them to the lab, we allow them a little bit of time to settle down, because they have undergone some stress moving from the field to the lab.
Absolutely.
So after that, we start doing experiments in the lab. So we have two components of it, field and the laboratory component.
Right. And you mentioned something very interesting. You said you're looking at different behavioral traits that these wild species exhibit. So can you give us some examples of what behavior aspects do you look at these fish when you want to study them?
Yeah. So zebrafish are group living fish, in the sense they are not solitary. So there are species that live in isolation, those that live in groups. So zebrafish happens to be a group living fish, and group living entails a lot of interactions between individuals living in the group. And people can ask a lot of questions as to what decides on who wants to swim with whom. So how is a shoal? It's called a shoal. So how is a shoal formed? So what are the interactions you see within a shoal? Are these shoals consistent, in the sense that if they are swimming together, do they always swim with one another, or do they break up and then move? So do individuals join other groups? So in order to ask these questions, you need to, of course, be able to identify them, which we are unfortunately not able to do, in the sense that we are not able to actually separate them out as A or B, because they are all identical.
Right.
So we do end up having to do small experiments which involve grouping them into smaller subsets, in the sense that looking at individuals like 2 individuals at a time, or 4 individuals, which also allows us at looking at interactions at the inter-individual behaviors. Like, are they aggressive towards one another? Which they are actually, because they do show some level of competition, where the competition might be for food, or it could be in terms of looking for a mate. So if there are 2 males, for instance, trying to court a female, there is a competition between them, which leads to aggressive interactions. So we are interested in looking at what drives certain aggressive levels in individuals. Are they all equally aggressive? Are there different levels of aggression? So those kind of interactions we study. We also study interactions like behavioral tendency, boldness tendencies. So for instance, in natural habitats, individuals need to take risks. Because if they don't take risks, they would not be able to find food sources, they would not be able to find new shelter sources, stuff like that. So in order to look at all of these, we have to do small manipulative experiments in the lab, where you actually do provide certain different challenges to fishes in the lab, and then you try to measure specific behavioral responses, like how good they are in exploration, how much time they take, for instance, from one end of a tank to another after navigating through a maze. So there we look at interactions with regards to what happens when say, for instance, there are individuals versus what happens when there are groups of individuals. Do they do better when they are alone, or do they do better when there are 2 individuals, or more? So these kind of variety of different types of behavioral responses.
This is definitely fascinating, Professor. So in your 2 decades study of fish behavior and recently the zebrafish behavior, are there any interesting insights you would like to point out, saying that, okay, you know what, this was unknown to science and this is what we found, and things like that. Do you want to share any of these remarkable discoveries, so to say, regarding the behavior that zebrafish exhibit?
Yes, in the sense that a lot of what we have seen are have not been studied in zebrafish, I agree, but some things have been already looked at in other species. For instance, in the guppy system, or there are some other group of fishes called sticklebacks. However, if you look at certain other very intricate behaviors, for instance, in the case of zebrafish, they are known to exist in a variety of different environmental conditions. They are known to exist in, say, very stagnant conditions.
Right.
They are known to occur in also moving streams. Now, one would expect that because it's the same species,
True.
you would expect that certain types of behaviors would be very standard, whether you studied them in a pond ecosystem or whether if you see it in a stream ecosystem. We found to our fascination that depending on which kind of behavior you are studying, you would not necessarily have hard-grained or wired kind of responses.
Okay.
You actually see, depending on which behavior you study, different types of behaviors might be more flexible. Some might be extremely rigid.
Right.
So, for instance, shoaling. The shoaling behavior in fish is a trait which seems to be very, very hardwired. You do not see differences in shoaling tendency, whether it's a fish which is found in a pond or whether it's a fish found in a stream, and the extent of cohesiveness in a shoal may not differ that drastically.
Okay.
On the other hand, other behaviors like aggression seems to be extremely flexible. Depending on which kind of region and what kind of ecological conditions are provided, it tends to fluctuate.
That means to say these fish are quite plastic, right?
Yeah,
I mean, they can, based on what kind of surrounding you put them in, they tend to display different attributes. And do they also learn?
They do.
Oh.
They do. In fact, that's a very good question, because we got fascinated looking at to look at learning, because we know that they are all vertebrates at the end of the day. We are vertebrates and they are the other end. And it's very interesting to look at at what time simple basic traits like learning could have evolved. And interestingly, fishes can also learn. They look like extremely simple life forms.
Exactly.
They are vertebrates and they do learn. Wow. And we have been doing some amount of our research is dedicated towards looking at learning, and especially spatial learning. So what we are looking at is how in ecological conditions help individual learning tendencies. And again, this is one of those traits which seems to be very flexible. Depending on what kind of habitats they come from, learning abilities also tend to change.
I think with this input, we will be probably looking at fish in a new light. The fact that they are intelligent, they can learn, and they have plasticity in their behavior based on what surroundings you put them in. Quite interesting and fascinating organisms for sure. And I'm not surprised that you were fascinated by them now. Now shifting a little bit towards you did explain to us about the importance of fish in the ecological system, and one of the obvious threats these fish face today is being pollution and degradation of our water sources. We are adding things that we shouldn't be adding there in the first place, and then we are also doing the other interesting aspect that we are doing to our water systems is constructing artificial barriers. And since your study has been on fish which are in flowing systems, do you see what kind of threats these barriers place on fish, and how have they influenced them?
Yeah, unfortunately in our country, we though we love our fish, we do not love them enough to the extent that we want to save them. And more and more we are seeing scenarios where natural habitats are getting destroyed, and this is especially true for stream ecosystems and river ecosystems, because water is a very, very scarce resource and it's becoming more and more scarce, and people are going all out to utilize any possible source of water. And as years go by, and unfortunately it's going to get worse, and dam construction is one of the biggest problems that is happening. The other problem is related to pollution, which again something that is really worrisome.
That's true.
And in more recent times we are also talking about changing the river course itself.
Right.
As man is becoming more and more advanced, so to speak, in being able to do things, manipulate the environment. We are now looking to do beyond, change our own ecosystems,
that is
aquatic
true.
ecosystems, and aquatic systems are going to get changed over the coming years.
True.
And freshwater fishes are going to be one of the first ones to face the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you brought up an interesting point about interlinking rivers, and that's been a major project that's been there on the table of any government that comes in to say, okay, when you interlink rivers, obviously, you can share water, and the positive side of that is that everybody gets water. There are going to be no floods, no droughts. Wonderful, ideal kind of a scenario. But then when you really look into a detailed level of what kind of harm that projects like this do to the ecology and to quote unquote insequential organisms like fishes. Do you think this is going to be a major threat to all fish around the country?
See, it all depends on at what scale it's being thought of, and any such thing has to be preceded by extreme studies to see how that is likely to impact not just fishes, for that matter, all the aquatic fauna. Right. So I'm sure that we need to do things, because we are going to face problems of water, which means that a lot of people will need more water in the coming years, which means we have to do something. But even if as we do it, we should precede it with extremely stringent, careful thought, and maybe even if possible small experiments to see to what extent these kind of shifts are likely to affect aquatic systems.
Right. So do you think then, when you talk about experiments that could help us analyze what are the impacts of such big projects would be, studies like the ones that you do are going to then give some framework to kind of...
I really do hope so.
Okay.
Because we are studying things like what is the impact of, say, barriers on communities upstream and downstream of rivers. Those hopefully will give an indicator and give us some baseline information of the likely impacts if this is supposedly done at a larger scale.
Right. Considering there is so much work to be done, you also mentioned that most of diversity we have not yet well understood, and even impacts we have barely started to scratch the surface. So, what would be your hope for the next decade or so with aspiring ecologists who want to probably study fish? What are the kind of challenges they would be having, and what are the interesting areas they would start to look at?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of scope as far as freshwater systems is concerned. I think we have many more systems to study than there are people who would want to be studying it. So I would say that at this point of time, more the merrier.
Okay.
And in terms of infrastructure, we really don't need too much. It's like an ecological study.
Right.
Studying freshwater ecosystems is one of the most easy things to do. It might be physically exhausting, challenging, but in terms of infrastructure or equipment requirement, it does not ask for much. It just needs your zeal and your interest. And that is what I hope the coming generation of students would be interested in.
Yes, we hope so too, considering there is so much to know in the future. Are there any citizen science driven initiatives that you are aware of which can help people enthuse with the study of fish or contribute so that people like you can take that up further?
There are some NGOs.
Okay.
There are some NGOs, especially around Bangalore, for instance, that I know of, where people are interested in looking at freshwater systems in general. But across the country, unfortunately, we don't have enough of citizen science-driven initiatives, which I think is again another thing that many people who might be interested in starting. That would be something that
right.
Like for instance, in Bengal, I'm not too aware of. Although we have so much of water bodies around, we don't have any citizen science driven initiatives.
True. And I hope more and many more would come up so that we tend to appreciate and understand the systems around us. The other thing is also that fish is a quite an important source of food for many in the country, and of course for many in the world across as well. One is for the nutritional value, and also because of the kind of dishes that get cooked up. And when it comes to food security and things like that, where do you place fish?
So that's a big question because fish, as I told you, are found everywhere.
True.
And when it comes to commercial fishing around the world at a global level, I think the biggest group of fishes that are getting impacted are the marine fishes. One of the biggest threatened groups are actually the marine fishes.
True.
The freshwater fishes are come somewhere down the line. Yet there are commercial species of fishes that are also slowly getting affected. But so far at this point of time, I would put more stress on the fact that we need to protect our marine species because those habitats are definitely under massive threat as of now.
Right, and there is also overfishing.
Overfishing, and that is mostly in the marine systems more than in the freshwater systems.
So next time the fish is on your plate, you probably want to think about where it's coming from and whether it's being fished sustainably. So sustainable fishing is another thing that's gaining popularity, to say, okay, I eat the fish only when it is the right time in the year to eat it.
Yes.
You're not disturbing the breeding season, you're not disturbing when the fish is really young.
Absolutely.
And you're sustainably fishing it so that you're not depleting the population.
Absolutely.
So I think with steps like this, are you hopeful in the next few years we'll be still able to conserve what is left of the fish that is around us?
I really do hope so, because people are becoming aware about it. It's just going at a very slow pace. We need to increase that pace. But I'm really hopeful. I'm an optimistic person, so I think it at some point of time people will realize and it will turn around. We still have a scope.
Right. And considering the issue of overfishing, do you think India is one of the countries which is actually facing a big problem in that sense?
We have a big population,
right.
And going by that, I think our consumption is also high. However, as of now, the freshwater systems are not in that state of threat.
Okay.
But given that we have a fairly big coastline, and a lot of the coastline habitats are actually facing a lot of deterioration and effects of overfishing, I think we need to address that at this point of time, because if not now, in the near future, we are going to face problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, Professor, we've had a great discussion about, starting from why fish is important to the fact that fish can do a lot more, provide us food, of course, and then it's responsible of us to kind of, make sure that we take care of the fish community, because they, if not anything, at least feed us, right?
Yes.
So with this in mind, do you have any things that you want to share to up and coming enthusiasts who are not only looking at ecology but looking at fish ecology in specific, and anything that you want to share at this point in time, being in the field for like about 20 years now?
Yes, I would say that any upcoming students who are interested to do freshwater ecology in the future, I would tell them that go all out for it, because there's a huge open space, open field for them out there, and they must do it now, because before you know, these systems are not going to be there anymore. So we need more people who can actually do it in the coming years. Otherwise, we are going to lose them before we even know what is there.
True.
Before we know how many fishes that there are, they would be gone.
That is true. And what kind of challenges can they expect when they get to study fish?
Well, in terms of challenges, it is more like at the personal level, because a lot of these areas are uninhabited areas, forested areas, which are not being studied much. But apart from that, from an ecological perspective, I would say it's an open field, some waiting to be explored.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think this episode is going to inspire a lot of people who are now definitely going to look at fish under a different light. So thank you so much for being an amazing guest for today's episode, and then I hope this episode really makes it a point to enthuse people to get into ecology and specifically study fish more, so that we get to know what kind of fish exist around us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking. I just hope that some of this will be helpful for students.
Oh, definitely. We hope it is going to be helpful for a lot of people who are listening and who may not just be students but general public too. So thank you so much for your time. thank you for listening into this episode of Joy of Science. We will be back with more. For more episodes of Joy of Science and other Research Matter podcasts, please log into www.researchmatters.in. Thank you.